Throughout history, religion has been a core pillar of most human societies. This was also true for the ancient Romans. Although the Roman Empire was known as a bastion of Christianity for the last millennium of its existence, it is better known for the polytheistic religions that preceded it. From the patricians to the plebeians and the lowliest of slaves, the Roman people were deeply religious. They honored many gods and strived to be pious, so as to appease them and not make their own lives more difficult. Welcome to our video on the evolution of religion in Roman society. From the earliest Roman religious practices to the Greek influence to the rise of the emperors and the adoption of Christianity. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our free content through our program of exclusive videos made for our members and patrons, who get 2 documentaries per week not available to the public. We've got a growing collection featuring the First Punic War, the history of Prussia, the Italian Unification Wars, and a review of the classic text Xenophon's Anabasis. We're now covering the Russo-Japanese War and Albigensian Crusades, not to mention our massive Pacific War week-by-week coverage, and a massive pool of other projects. All this is made for and with generous donations from our backers. So if you're enjoying our content and want to see more and support the cause of history, consider becoming a YouTube member or patron. You'll also get early access to public content, a spot in our lively Discord server, and behind-the-scenes info and goodies. We rely on our backers to support our growing team pumping out these videos, so thank you to everyone already involved, and we hope you'll consider joining in too. As Rome conquered new lands, many different peoples became part of the state, and their beliefs and customs influenced the Roman religion itself. Indeed, the most well-known form of the ancient Roman religion was in itself an amalgamation of mostly the old Roman faith, the Etruscan religion, and Greek polytheism, most notably the latter. The primeval Roman religion was very different from the caste of gods we associate with Rome today, which would be the one influenced by the Greeks' Olympian pantheon. The point at which the original Roman faith begins falling under intensive Greek influence and drastically transforming into its recognizable shape is a matter of scholarly debate. Most historians, however, speculate that the religion began evolving in that direction at some point during the 4th century BC. At that point, the Romans had conquered most of their non-Greek neighbors in the Italian peninsula, and without Etruscan and Campanian influences keeping a certain balance, the Greek religion had become the dominant outside factor. Most of the information which exists about the Roman faith before its deep syncretism with the Greek pantheon was written much later, by men like the 1st century BC historian Livy. These records are generally unreliable. It is possible that these Roman writers may have purposefully omitted less than ideal details about Rome's cultural past, while alternatively, knowledge of these archaic Roman rites may have been lost to time by the late Republican era. Direct historical sources on Rome's earliest period are scarce, and all that exists from that age are a handful of difficult epigraphical texts and scant archaeological evidence. The origins of the Roman religion are as obscure as its foundation and early history, but we can glean clues of how it functioned and developed by observing the archaeological record. In Latium, in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, there is no evidence of organized religion, images of gods, or even the existence of temples and priests. Nevertheless, some forms of rituals were present, as places for sacrifices are commonly found. In these places, looms, ceramic bowls, and other items of everyday use were gathered. Additionally, with the spread of cremation and urn cultures to Italy, burial grounds and necropolises started appearing in the territory of Rome as well. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries, however, burials had become increasingly rare, having been replaced by public buildings. As the Iron Age continued, Greeks started colonizing the Italian peninsula, all while the Phoenicians and Cypriots started spreading their trade routes to ever more distant parts of the Mediterranean. The influence of these cultures on Roman religious practices can be seen as early as the 8th century BC. The aforementioned burials became extravagant, particularly in so-called princely burials, such as the great tombs of Praeneste outside the city of Rome. This early Greek and Phoenician impact on Roman religion was as much economical as it was cultural. The trade that they had facilitated greatly increased Rome's prosperity and led to rising levels of luxury, especially among the ruling elites. Other major sites that coincide with the expansion of Greek and Phoenician influence are temple complexes at Satricum and St. Omobono. The religious influence of St. Omobono can be seen even to this day, as a Christian church is present at the site. Meanwhile, the temple at Satricum was dedicated to Mata Matuta, the predecessor of the goddess of dawn, Aurora. It is also evident that temples had communicated with each other, as the one at St. Omobono was dedicated to the goddess Fortuna, the partner of Mata Matata. The temple at Satricum is surrounded by large buildings, which archaeologists believe to be dining halls. Communal dining spaces adjacent to cultic sites were present in the Greek world, further indicating the rise of Greek influence in Rome. As Roman society and politics developed in the first centuries after its founding, religion also became increasingly complex. Much like the early Roman state and other aspects of their religion, the gods themselves have mysterious beginnings too. The English historian H.S. Rose states that the Roman gods may have evolved from more primitive religious views. According to him, supernatural and divine acts, or a very divine presence, were given the name noumen. The direct translation of noumen is that which is produced by nodding, in a less literal sense, meaning an act that represents the product or expression of power. Since noumen is found in a variety of places, it is attached to a myriad of phenomena, things, and even people. For a large period of time, before the religion became more organized, the noumen was a very personal affair for each Roman, rather than possessing any collective identity. According to H.S. Rose, if they were strong, and especially if they were regular in their occurrence, the natural conclusion would be that they were produced by a kind of person who had much noumen, and was ready to display it for the benefit of those who approached him in the right manner. This person is believed to have gradually evolved into one of the many Roman gods and goddesses. However, that evolution was slow. In accordance with this theory, early on, Jupiter was nothing more than a flint, and Mars was represented by a simple spear. As to why the Roman gods started out this way, and were only later given human characteristics, Rose simply states that it was due to a lack of artistic maturity within Roman culture. Another thing worth mentioning about the early Roman religion is its apparent lack of an expansive mythology, such as the ones that the Greeks and Indians had created for their gods. Due to lack of evidence, it is difficult to say whether the mythology was forgotten and lost to time, or whether the Romans had simply never created one in the first place. This is another reason why it is deemed possible that the Roman gods did not initially possess human characteristics. At the end of the Etruscan period, when the three Capitoline gods were united in a single temple, it wasn't even certain that Jupiter and Juno were even seen as husband and wife. Some of the old Roman gods had received more detailed mythologies after the Romans started modeling their religion after the Greek one. Nevertheless, several important gods did not receive the same attention, and their mythologies remain mostly unknown. For example, Quirinus, who is believed to be the opposite of Mars, is today sometimes even misidentified with him. Though the worship of Quirinus became nearly extinct by the time of the Empire, the Roman hill named after him, the Quirinal, continues to be considered one of the most important places in the country. Mars, as an exception to the rule, went through relatively little change, unlike the majority of the other gods. His role was perpetual and stable, the typical role of a war god. A goddess whose importance likewise dwindled as the centuries passed is the aforementioned Mata Matata. This primordial mother figure goddess held great importance during Rome's early days. During her feast day, the Matralia, women that were married for the first time would gather and feast together, after which they would ask for blessings for their children and the children of the other women that participated. She is generally believed to be the goddess of dawn, and that she was later made equivalent to Aurora. One myth surrounding her has been recovered. and George Dumezil recounts it in his book Archaic Roman Religion. Dawn suckles or licks the child who either belongs to herself and her sister Night in common, or to that sister alone. Thanks to this care, this child, the sun, which has emerged from the womb of Night, arrives at the maturity of day. One of the things which the archaic and late Roman religion had in common was that Jupiter was the principal god. Although Rome's Capitoline triad of gods, consisting of Jupiter, Juno and Minerva, is well known, the hierarchy of gods was very different in Rome's early days. The so-called Archaic Triad consisted of Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus. Initially, Jupiter is believed to have been a sky god and the master of the thunderbolt. Unlike his Greek counterpart Zeus, Jupiter seems to have been much more down to earth. Zeus, as the grandson of heaven, remained fully celestial and retained a connection with the heavenly bodies. On the other hand, in the early Roman religion, there was little interest in the sun and moon, and virtually none at all in the stars and the firmament. It is also speculated that Jupiter was the master of rain, with the ritual of Nudipedalia and the ritual of Lapis Manalis, both intended to bring rain, being connected with him. As god of the sky, he was also deeply involved with the process of augury, something which can be seen from a legend dating to the very founding of Rome. Before Rome was even founded, Romulus and Remus could not even agree about the place where they would build the city. Remus proposed the Aventine Hill, as it was easy to defend, while Romulus recommended the much less strategically viable Palatine Hill. Unable to come to an agreement, the two of them decided to test their skills of augury. While Remus only saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12 on his side. Therefore, the heart of Rome was built on the Palatine Hill. Another famous legend surrounding Jupiter and Rome's early days are the negotiations between the god and Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius. In the myth, Jupiter asks for a sacrifice, cut off a head, to which Numa replies, an onion. Jupiter rejoins with a man's, without mentioning the head again. The king, seeing another opportunity, answers with a man's hair. Jupiter once again repeats his mistake and demands a life. Numa, unwavering to the very end, interrupts with of a fish. As a result, Jupiter rewarded Numa for his shrewdness and did not ask for anything more. This myth also illustrates the attitude of the Romans in their religious and social life. According to George Dumezil, the Romans strived to speak without imprudence, to say nothing, and above all to use no formula by which the god or his human spokesman might benefit at his expense, nothing which would irritate the god or which might be misconstrued or misunderstood. Speaking of the legendary King Numa, the establishment of most of ancient Rome's religious institutions are attributed to him. One of the most famous of such institutions are the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, who tended to the fire of Vesta. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and it was believed that while her fire burned, Rome would be immortal. In case the fire ever went out, it was forbidden for it to be relighted with flames from another fire. Instead, a new fire was created by the Vestal Virgins. Although Numa may have established the Vestal Virgins in Rome, the cult itself is believed to be much older. In fact, some sources state that Romulus and Remus's mother was a priestess of Vesta in Alba Longa. That being said, she most likely was not a virgin. The Roman calendar is also believed to have been established by King Numa. This calendar consisted of 355 days, with a biennial addition of 22 days. On average, this calendar was extremely precise for those times. Numa Pompilius is also credited with having established Rome's priesthood. The official highest title in the Roman priesthood was that of Rex Sancrorum. The Rex Sancrorum made a sacrifice on the calends of each month and announced the respective month's festivals on the nones. Following the Rex Sancrorum, the next most powerful priests were the Flaminis Dealis, Martialis, and Quirinalis, the high priests of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. The position of Pontifex Maximus was only the 5th in this religious hierarchy. However, for most of Rome's existence, it had the most power. whether the Pontifex Maximus was envisioned to be the most powerful from the very beginning, or whether the position acquired its power at some point in later centuries is not yet known. One interesting topic, which is unfortunately still relatively unknown, is the relationship between the early Roman state and the many domestic Lares and Penates. Every home had its own such deities. The Lares were often envisaged as guardians of Rome, while the Penates were identified with sacred objects brought to Latium from Troy by Aeneas. Another thing worth mentioning is that the Etruscan influence on the Roman religion could very well be greater than the Greek influence. It is speculated that during the rule of the Tarquin kings of Rome, who were of Etruscan origin, the Roman religion adopted many Etruscan properties. Even the Capitoline Triad of Jupiter, Juno and Minerva could have been derived from the Etruscan Triad of Tinia, Uni and Minerva. However, since the Etruscan religion also came under heavy Greek influence, this may all be a moot point. Just like every other world religion, the Roman religion changed and evolved heavily during the course of its existence. Despite the fact that the Greek pantheon had an overwhelming influence on the Roman one, the two of them were not identical. The Roman people had their own unique beliefs, and the more we uncover about the origins of their faith, the more we can learn about their history as well. Greek culture had always been in Rome's general neighborhood, with the Hellenes having set up colonies in southern Italy as early as the 8th century BCE. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had emerged as the biggest player in the peninsula, coming to dominate other Italian peoples like the Etruscans and Samnites, and by the 3rd century BCE had brought the Hellenes of Magna Graecia into their domain. Consequently, educated Greek slaves were taken in by Roman families to serve as tutors, introducing new generations of Roman children to the Greek religion. Considering the fact that Hellenic culture in Greece proper was reaching its apex during the 3rd century, it is of no surprise that the Roman religion came under such extensive Greek influence. The impact of Greek religion on Latin beliefs can be observed in the transformative effect it had on the mythological canon surrounding Roman gods. While the early Romans had some mythology in their religion, the overwhelming majority of it was concerned not with their gods, but their mortal founders, Romulus and Remus, and the second king, Numa Pompilius. As we have mentioned previously, early Roman gods did not have any specific personalities or relationships with each other, and it is uncertain whether they were even depicted with anthropomorphic human forms. On the other hand, the Greeks had a well-developed and expansive mythology, dating back as far as the previous millennium. As such, Romans began identifying their gods with the Greek ones, and used Greek mythological canon to answer new questions about their gods' aspects and personalities previously left blank by older Roman folklore. Similar to Zeus, Jupiter became the god of the sky, wielding thunderbolts and having an eagle as a companion. Juno was his sister wife and the goddess of fertility, wealth and community. In essence, she was the equivalent of Hera. The last of the Capitoline Triad, Minerva, was equated to the Greek goddess of wisdom and strategy, Athena. Other Greek gods became the basis for their Roman counterparts as well. Neptune became the Roman version of Poseidon, Mars became the equivalent of Ares, Dispater the equivalent of Hades, and so on. The divine twins of Greek mythology were also directly adopted by the Romans, retaining their original names, Castor and Pollux. The Dioscuri, as they were known, were the patrons of sailors and appeared to men at sea through a weather phenomenon known today as St. Elmo's fire. For the Romans, they were also connected with hospitality and horsemanship. One notable exception to all of these parallels is Apollo. Apollo was not given a Roman identity, but was treated instead as he was in Greek mythology. This may be due to the fact that the Romans had already known of Apollo from as early as the 6th century BCE, with there being a shrine or temple dedicated to him in Rome at the time. The myth surrounding the arrival of Apollo in Rome is connected to the Sibyl of Cumae. During the reign of Rome's last king, Tarquin, the Sibyl of Cumae, who presided over the oracle of Apollo, arrived in Rome. She brought with her 9 books of prophecy and offered to sell them to Tarquin. Deeming her price too high, the king refused. The Sibyl promptly burned 6 of the 9 books, and at that point Tarquin reconsidered. He bought the remaining 3. The Romans consulted these books in times of crises. They were, however, lost when a millennia later, the western half of the empire collapsed in 476 AD. Although it is easy to assume that at some point the Roman gods became exact copies of their Greek counterparts, the reality was slightly different. In spite of their identification with the Greek gods, Roman gods still had far less elaborate and colourful mythologies. For example, there is relatively little known about Jupiter's childhood, whereas Zeus's childhood is known in detail. Jupiter's proclivity for sexual escapades is also less emphasized than his Greek parallel. This is not due to the fact that the Romans lacked the creativity to add those stories, but due to a lack of interest. Ever the pragmatists, the Romans were not particularly interested in the gods' personalities and what their origins were. Instead, they focused on pietas, piety. For the Romans, their priority when it came to religion was that they performed their duties towards the gods as correctly as possible in order to appease them and receive good fortune. As for morality, the Romans did not derive it from the dogma of their religion. Nevertheless, they still had certain norms as to what can be considered appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Another way by which the Greeks influenced the Roman religious landscape was their contributions in jumpstarting the popularity of many local cults devoted to foreign gods, both Greek in origin or from further afield in Africa and Asia. The most notable of these cults were the cults of Mithra, Bacchus, Cybele, Isis, and Serapis. Some of them did quite well. Cybele, a mother goddess from Asia Minor, found its way to Rome after spreading throughout the Greek world. Initially, the cult was banned due to some unsavory practices, such as the castration of its priests. But the Romans adopted her cult after the Sibylline oracle recommended doing so in 205 BC, renaming her as Magna Mater. Magna Mater was later reinvented as a Trojan goddess, giving her a great amount of legitimacy. Other cults did not see the same success. The cult of Bacchus was extremely popular at the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 2nd century BC. His cult was most likely derived from Dionysius, the Greek god of wine. Followers of the Bacchus cult regularly engaged in hedonistic acts. Bacchus's festival, the Bacchanalia, was a period of great disinhibition and depravity. In fact, the word Bacchanalia is used for acts of debauchery to this very day in many languages. In 186 BC, the Roman Senate decided that the cult was dangerous and had a corruptive influence on Roman society. The cult of Bacchus was subsequently suppressed, and as many as 4,000 people in Italy were executed in the purges. As Greek influence protruded deep into every crack of Roman religion and myth, it also came to influence how the Romans understood their own history, as the cornerstone of Greek mythology, the Iliad, was woven into the founding of Rome itself. According to Roman mythology, the Homeric hero Aeneas came to Latium after the fall of Troy and married the daughter of a local king. Their descendants were the legendary founders of Rome. As Aeneas's mother was thought to be Aphrodite, it meant that Romulus and Remus were also descended from the Greek counterpart to Venus. Aeneas also is said to have brought with him the Palladium, a cult image of Minerva, Athena. This Palladium represented one of Rome's Picnora Imperii, or pledges of rule in English. They were supposed to guarantee the continued power of Rome. An object believed by the Romans to be that very Palladium was kept in the inner sanctum of the Temple of Vesta. Indeed, these relations between humans and gods did not stop there. Servius Tullius, one of the kings of Rome, was thought to have been a lover of the goddess Fortuna, the Roman equivalent of Tyche. Julius Caesar, tracing his roots back to Aeneas, was also stylized as a descendant of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Let us take a brief aside to talk about religious architecture. Contrary to popular belief, Roman temples were not overly similar to Greek temples. The only noticeable Greek influence on Roman temples is the columns. The arches, however, were usually built in the older Etruscan style. Roman temples, though generally larger than Greek ones, had much smaller inner chambers. This is likely due to the fact that the insides of Roman temples were not accessible to the wider populace, as public ceremonies were generally outside. The temples were also considered to be the dwellings of the gods themselves, so it is of no surprise that only a select few were allowed to enter. Temples in Rome were sacred places, but it is worth noting that what the Romans considered sacred may differ from what people in the modern world consider sacred. For the Romans, any action, secular or religious, that was done for Rome or its people was considered sacred. As such, government and faith blended seamlessly, as the Senate would occasionally hold meetings in a Roman temple if the topic discussed concerned the god or gods in question. State economics were also bound up in state spiritualism, as the Roman treasury was housed in the Temple of Saturn, the god of time, wealth, and abundance. With the evolution of the Roman Republic and the city of Rome, the Roman religion's rituals underwent great expansion, refinement, and improvement. The Roman gods became more complex, and standards and norms became formalized for rituals regarding those gods, both in state and personal religious practice. Grand rituals required a great number of participants, and people would flock from distant parts of the realm to take part in them. The rituals could not be held if favorable auspices were not observed by two persons working in tandem. Both for public and private religious matters, the ritual would start at the beginning of the day. An exception to this is sacrifices, which were considered magic and usually took place at night and in secret. At first, the celebrants would wash themselves and put on their special ceremonial robes. Special ceremonial robes, according to Roman rites, consisted of a citizen toga draped so that the arms would be free and the head would be at least partially covered. Once all preparations were complete, a procession of the faithful moved towards the altar of the god that was to be honored. The celebrants poured wine and incense into a portable hearth. The hearth represented the identity of the celebrants, indicating to the gods who was honoring them at that specific ritual. This part of the ritual is known as the prefatio. The second part was known as immolatio, and was when the actual sacrifice would take place. The animal victims were usually cattle, pigs, goats, or sheep. In the vast majority of cases, the sex of the animal had to correspond to the sex of the god. Most male gods required a castrated male animal to be sacrificed, but Mars, Janus, and Neptune were offered beasts with their genitalia intact. The gods of the upper world received white-furred animals, while gods of the underworld, like Dis, were associated with dark-coated animals. Plants, liquids, and incense were also considered suitable sacrifices. The age of the animal victims depended on whether it was a public or private ritual, and on the social standing of the celebrant. The animal's back was sprinkled with a type of salted flour known as molla salsa, and wine was poured to run along its brow. The celebrant then ran the sacrificial knife along its spine. This represented a transfer of the animal from human property, which the molla salsa represented, to the property of the gods, which the wine represented. Once this transaction was completed, a sacrificer would strike and bleed the animal. If the animal showed any fear or panic during this process, it would be considered an ill omen. Once the animal was dead, it was placed on its sides and disemboweled. If the entrails were intact, the sacrifice was accepted by the gods. In the situation that there were abnormalities with the entrails, the sacrifice would be annulled. During certain rituals, the entrails would also be inspected for the act of haruspicy. The entrails, which were considered to belong to the gods, were subsequently cooked. Depending on which gods were honored, those entrails were later either burned in the altar's sacrificial fire, thrown into the sea if they were for an aquatic god, or in a ditch if they were for a god of the underworld. This entire process was accompanied by prayers which unambiguously specified who was conducting the sacrifice who was honoured in the sacrifice, and what benefits were expected from the sacrifice. After the sacrifice, a sacrificial banquet would be held. As Roman religious rites became more and more elaborate, the ability of powerful individuals to leverage religious influence for political power grew. As mentioned previously in this video, the position of the Pontifex Maximus, or High Priest, was the most powerful position in the religious hierarchy of Rome, and by the time of the 1st century BC, also came to represent one of the most powerful positions in the Roman Republic itself. Presiding over religious matters meant that the Pontifex Maximus also presided over vast parts of Rome's social life. Julius Caesar used this power to fix a matter which had been causing significant problems to the Roman state, the calendar. In 46 BC, Caesar, together with Sosigenes of Alexandria, devised one of the most useful and precise calendars in history. The basis of this calendar was the Egyptian calendar, which consisted of 12 30-day months and an additional 5 days in the end. This totaled 365 days. The additional 5 days were distributed over some of the months. February, considered to be an unlucky month, was also shortened by 2 days, which were added to other months. Because they calculated the actual length of the year to be 365 days, 1 day was added every 4th year. The dates were still out of sync with this calendar, so in order for it to be properly aligned, Julius Caesar added another 3 intercalary months to that year. This made 46 BC the longest year in history, standing at 445 days. The Julian calendar, as it became known, represented one of the most precise calendars in history, being used to this day with only slight modifications. The Roman religion underwent drastic changes from its archaic form during the last half of the 1st millennium BC. The Republic and its expansion ensured that the religion would have an organized structure and a deep influence on Roman society. However, it also ensured that the religion would be as inclusive as possible towards the new people that joined the Roman realm. By the time Julius Caesar had instated his revolutionary calendar, the Republic was already on its deathbed. In the tumultuous decades that followed, the Roman world and religion itself would undergo even more drastic changes, changes that would see mere mortal men become gods. With the Roman Republic undergoing seemingly endless territorial and economic expansion in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, it also entered a state of perpetual civil unrest and political instability. The intrinsic system of the Republic was designed so that no man or faction would become too powerful. However, as Rome's power and territory grew, so too did the power of certain outstanding individuals. This disparity between theory and practice in Roman society only grew wider after the military reforms of Gaius Marius, which effectively ensured that Roman generals could command a great deal of power. Ironically, it was Marius's bitter rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, that made great use of this situation. Sulla's victory over Marius in the first great civil war in the Republic's history positioned him as the first man of Rome. However, in spite of the fact that he used his newfound dictatorial powers to change laws and purge his enemies, he left the political institutions of the Roman Republic fundamentally unchanged. Significant changes to the system may not have been done, yet the Republic's facade of stability was permanently crippled. Indeed, it took not even 3 decades for Rome to descend into chaos again. Much like his predecessor Sulla, Julius Caesar fought a civil war and became the head of the Roman state. Be that as it may, this is where the similarities between the two end. Unlike Sulla, Caesar had much greater ambitions, and retiring to live a quiet life in the country was not one of them. Whereas Sulla only went as far as to be called favoured by Venus, Caesar had portrayed himself as a descendant both of the goddess of love Venus and of Rome's founder, Romulus. In doing so, Caesar created a cult of worship around himself, which would become the foundation of the deification of later Roman emperors. According to Ittai Gradl, there were 3 phases in the creation of Caesar's cult. After his victory at the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC, The Senate decreed that a statue of him would be placed on the Capitol, with an inscription stating that he was a demigod. Caesar's victory at Munda was followed by the placement of a statue of him in the Temple of Quirinus, with the inscription reading that he was an unconquered god. In the final stage of Caesar's cult, he was equated with Rome's official gods, with his cult being given an official name, Divus Julius, as well as a priest and temple. The last phase did not materialize, as Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March before his flamen, Mark Antony, was inaugurated as priest. Octavian, though quite young at the time of Caesar's death, was wise enough not to follow in some of his stepfather's footsteps. Believing that Caesar's incessant honouring of his own person was the cause of his undoing, he steered clear of self-aggrandizement after his rise to power. Octavian was planning to rule Rome for slightly more than a few years, and approached the matter of his spiritual legitimacy carefully and patiently. In 29 BC, he dedicated a temple to Divus Julius at the site of Caesar's cremation, thereby cementing his position as Divi Filius, the son of a god. While Octavian would not refer to himself as a god openly during his entire reign, he did little to hinder others from considering him as such. It was this fine line that Octavian walked in politics as well, never positioning himself as a dictator or a pseudo-monarch, but as a princeps, a primus inter pares. Agrippa intended to dedicate a new temple on the Campus Martius to the first princeps, with his cult image inside it. Augustus prohibited Agrippa from carrying out this plan, and the temple, later known as the Pantheon, was dedicated to other purposes. Two words which perfectly describe the Roman religion after Octavian's ascension to power are tradition and innovation. Following nearly a century of strife in Rome, Octavian had brought long-desired peace. Since the Roman state and religion were inherently linked, this was not just an earthly peace, but the peace of the gods. All of the temples, shrines, and buildings which Octavian had rebuilt were not dedicated to himself. Instead, he chose a rather subtle approach by ensuring that the people of Rome knew while the buildings themselves weren't made in his honor, the initiative to rebuild them had been his. Moreover, these buildings were formally dedicated on dates that were important to him, such as birthdays and anniversaries of important victories. Meanwhile, Octavian also expertly maneuvered through Caesar's controversial connection with Romulus and the Roman kingdom. He restored and reformed the old priesthood, which boasted about its mythical connection with the founder of the Eternal City, who was considered a divisive figure during the late Republic, since Romulus had been a king, and the Romans of the Republic hated kings. Although Octavian would have loved nothing more than to associate himself with Romulus, he decided against it due to the fact that a monarchy stood in stark contrast with everything that the Republic, and therefore he, officially stood for. In the end, Octavian's advisors discovered that he could be partially a god and a king, yet neither at the same time. As Octavian had restored the peace of the gods through August augury, a divine technique that Romulus used when founding the city, he was given the honorific epithet Augustus, an adjective with substantial religious notes, yet also unburdened by any direct allusions to kingship. Once Lepidus had died in 12 BC, Augustus formally became Pontifex Maximus, a title that would become hereditary after his death. He restored Rome's old priesthoods, and also reorganized Rome's neighborhoods, or vici, in such a way that the majority of the community leaders, or vicomagistri, were freedmen and other commoners. This made him extremely popular with Rome's lower classes, and had a great influence on the Imperial Cult, becoming a household and community cult. In Rome, Augustus respected the sentiments of the Senate, and accepted a compromise that did not allow him to directly establish a cult for himself. The situation was completely different outside of the city. Numerous local cults that treated Augustus akin to a god are believed to have been unofficially sponsored by the state. However, in state religion, Augustus was not officially deified preceding his death. In fact, when writing about his death, Tacitus makes no mention of Augustus as a god, devoting only a minor remark about his burial. Once it had been completed according to custom, a temple and rituals typical for celestial beings were decreed. These local cults were enthusiastically accepted in the rest of Italy. over time becoming household cults. One example of this is Forum Clodii in northern Italy, where inscriptions related to the cult make it clear that they equated the worship of Augustus's divinity to the worship of Augustus the god. Outside Italy, the situation differed in each province and municipality. For the most part, outside of Rome, Augustus was directly worshipped as a deity, especially in the Greek provinces, where the imperial cult was viewed as a continuation of the cults of Hellenistic rulers of Alexander's Diadochi. Although people generally did not directly equate him to the existing pantheon of Roman gods, Augustus was given godlike honors. When Augustus shared a temple with other deities, the Greeks were careful not to represent him as the god's equal. In peripheral provinces, such as Gallia Lugdunensis and Germania Inferior, the imperial cult did not begin thriving until decades after it did in Italy, Spain, or Asia Minor. However, due to the strong military presence in those regions, military commanders in those provinces would occasionally establish shrines to Augustus, which slowly introduced the people of those areas to the imperial cult. Before we continue, it's worth mentioning that emperor worship had nothing to do with personal deities that could guide people to salvation. The Roman religion was not a religion of salvation, and the rituals of the religion were regarded with much higher importance than the dogma. That being said, it is possible that certain people viewed Augustus as a deity who brought salvation from many decades of war and instability. The imperial cult was also not exclusive to the Greco-Roman religion, as worshippers of various other pantheons in the empire also honored the emperors, often more than the Romans themselves. One of Augustus's greatest legacies was that he left the Roman state in a more unified condition than that in which he had found it, and scholars believe that his cult was one of the driving forces behind it. Augustus was posthumously deified, which did not change much for Rome's religious landscape, owing to the fact that Tiberius rigidly kept the system that his predecessor had established. He not only refused to be deified while still alive, but also refused many of Augustus's godlike honors. Caligula's accession was far more complicated, as he was chosen as a co-heir with Tiberius's grandson, Tiberius Gemellus. Due to the fact that Gemellus was still a child, the Senate had rendered Tiberius's will invalid. Under these circumstances, Caligula could no longer claim the principate by the auctoritas inherited from Tiberius. Therefore, the Senate had to invest him with imperial powers by decree. This was, in essence, the first formal admission of the Roman state that it was, for the first time in over 500 years, once again a monarchy. Later in the same year, the Senate had ordered that sacrifices should take place to honor the new emperor. Caligula, uncharacteristically, refused this honor, as well as an offer to have a state temple dedicated to himself. However, later into his reign, his good relationship with the Senate, as well as his moderatio, began deteriorating heavily, and he began to humiliate the very institution that had granted him this power. There is no doubt about the fact that Caligula endlessly emphasized his limitless power. What is a matter of scholarly debate, however, is whether he claimed to be a god or was simply an eccentric. For example, the writer Phileo views Caligula's tendency to dress up like certain gods in public as an act of blasphemy, while Dio and Suetonius view it as the comportment of a lunatic. Archaeological findings show absolutely no evidence of Caligula ever being deified by the Roman state, which is in contrast with the modern view of him as a megalomaniac. Nevertheless, most future emperors steered clear of any dalliances with the divine, if not for any other reason than because of the obvious links between death and divinity. Many parallels can be drawn between Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus. Referring to themselves as Dominus et Deus and Romanus Hercules, respectively, they drew the ire of many of their contemporaries, along with modern scholars, though there is no clear proof that either of them had used those titles and honors outside of private settings and in an official capacity. The rule of another eccentric emperor, Nero, represented a great challenge for the imperial cult, not just because of his damnatio memoriae, but also for the reason that his death meant that the Julio-Claudian dynasty was no more. The new emperor, Vespasian, could in no way claim descent from the ancient kings of Rome, gods, or even the previous imperial family. To compensate for this, the Senate immediately started drawing similarities between Vespasian and Augustus, such as how both of them restored peace to Rome, how both were victorious in a civil war, and how both of their lives were marked by a myriad of good omens and oracles. On one hand, Vespasian publicly made great effort to further this cause, while on the other, he was known to boast about his obscure origins in private. Ironically, several Jewish scholars, such as Josephus, considered Vespasian to be a messianic figure of Judaism, due to the fact that he was the man from Judea who ruled the world. Vespasian approached his death and future deification with a sense of humor, with Suetonius remarking that his last words were, "I think I am becoming a god." As we have previously mentioned, the imperial cult quickly became a household cult. Unfortunately, owing to insufficient evidence, we know very few details about how it functioned in the average citizen's domestic life. Wall paintings and mosaics that were found in private houses from archaeological sites in cities like Ostia or Pompeii scarcely ever contain any reference to the emperors. Certain scholars do not consider this lack of evidence as a confirmation of the absence of a household imperial cult. This merely suggests that the imperial cult was focused on living rulers rather than deceased ones. Proof of this can be found in a letter from Fronto to his pupil Marcus Aurelius, which mentions that his likeness can be found in many private houses and businesses, though painted badly. The little archaeological evidence that exists is mostly represented by small sculptures of emperors and members of the imperial family. In one peculiar case, however, a life-size silver bust of Galba was found at Herculaneum, which was presumably left behind after the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. The fact that the imperial cult had been disseminated so quickly throughout the empire begs the question, how did it spread so far and so quickly? This is an especially interesting question considering the fact that the vast majority of emperors rarely left Rome and Italy, so only a handful of citizens had the opportunity to meet or see them. In these circumstances, the fabricated image of the emperor was used as a substitute for his presence. Coins were minted, statues were raised, and pictures were painted with their likeness, and for followers of the imperial cult, the conviction that a statue of the emperor was just as powerful as the emperor himself was more than just a primitive belief. From the late 2nd century AD, inscriptions started appearing where it is said that an individual or a group of people dedicated themselves to the emperor's divine power and his majesty. The priests of the imperial cult were no less ordinary than the flamen of any other Roman god. Their dress reflected the latest Roman fashion, and they would have many of the same duties as their colleagues that tended to other cults. A notable exception to this is the priests of the imperial cult in the eastern provinces, who were usually extravagantly dressed and wore a golden crown with the image of Caesar on it. The rituals likewise followed the Roman model. When Augustus was first consecrated, his birthday, along with the birthdays of Tiberius and his wife Livia, were marked by the sacrifice of an ox to Jupiter. Similarly, during the reign of Nero, the emperor's birthday was celebrated with sacrifices to the Capitoline Triad, the emperor's Genius, Concordia, and Salus Publica, which translates to public welfare. Rome's transformation into an empire may have saved it from a premature collapse and unified the different peoples of Rome behind its rulers. This was greatly aided by the imperial cult, which was accepted by people of many faiths, and although it caused certain problems over the centuries, it also proved to be a bastion of stability that Rome oftentimes desperately needed. The Roman imperial cult proved to be both resilient and malleable, surviving many a bad emperor, the year of the 4 emperors, the crisis of the 3rd century, and other tumultuous events. Nevertheless, it did not survive its confrontation with a religion almost as old as the cult itself, Christianity. To contextualize Christianity's rapid spread within the Roman Empire, we must understand the relationship between Rome and the many foreign religions it encountered during its expansion. As we have already mentioned previously, the Roman state was open to the incorporation and adoption of foreign deities and religious customs into their own. The first known influences were from the Greek and Etruscan religions, but through Rome's expansion, many new pantheons and beliefs became part of the Roman state. Oftentimes, the state itself had a hand in the adoption of new religious practices. However, it is also possible that the state simply sanctioned religious practices that were already prevalent by that time. This happened frequently during times of great crisis for Rome. By sanctioning certain religious practices, the Roman state ensured that it could eliminate features that it deemed dangerous without suppressing the religious practices completely. To quote Dionysius of Halicarnassus, even though Rome has imported certain rites on the recommendation of oracles, she celebrates them in accordance with her own traditions. One of the most serious religious conflicts that Rome had was with Judaism. Although initially the relationship between Rome and Jewish communities was amicable, and Jewish communities prospered throughout the Republic and Empire, that all changed during the first half of the 1st century AD. The fundamental conflict between Jewish monotheism and the Roman Imperial Cult, alongside intolerance and the destabilizing reigns of Caligula and Nero, precipitated the First Roman-Jewish War of 68 AD to 74 AD. It was during this war that Christianity was first mentioned as a separate religion from Judaism. In the year 70, the Jewish tax was introduced, and due to the fact that Christians did not pay it, it was later deduced that they were not Jews. The very first Christians were indeed Jews, and were known as Jewish Christians. This first version of Christianity was a practice very close to Judaism, and was predominantly localized in Judea and Galilee, where the historical Jesus of Nazareth held his ministry. After his execution, his followers began spreading Christianity throughout other parts of the Roman Empire. It is worth noting that this second version of Christianity was in many ways more liberal than the original. Subsequently, the majority of the new converts were Gentiles, non-Jews. The observing of the Sabbath, kosher food practices, and circumcision, among other things, were not required of these Christians. The fact that Jesus was also presented as human as well as divine deepened the conflict between Christianity and the strictly monotheistic and Unitarian Judaism. On the other hand, it was also what made Christianity feel less foreign to the rest of the Greco-Roman population, who were used to their gods having physical forms in one way or another. For the early Christians, the form of Christianity which they adopted depended for the most part on the person who converted them. If they were converted by a person who followed the stricter Jewish Christianity and adhered to the Mosaic laws, they would likely practice their religion in such a strict manner as well. Nevertheless, in between the liberal so-called Gentile Christianity and the rising of Rabbinic Judaism, both of which opposed it, Jewish Christianity virtually disappeared by the end of the 1st century AD. In spite of the virtually insignificant number of followers, Christianity proved to have an impact on life and politics in the empire almost from the start. According to Job Rupke, the main way in which this manifested itself was in conflicts within the Jewish community, which would escalate and cross into society at large when hostilities broke out between rival Jewish groups. Another instance of Christians catching the attention of the public and higher echelons of Rome's ruling class was the fact that they were blamed by Nero for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. This resulted in the first known persecution of Christians in Rome. The very first Christian church is believed to be the Cenacle, the room where the Last Supper supposedly took place. Otherwise, until Christianity was legalized by Constantine the Great, Christians gathered for services and worship in private houses. These house churches were convenient due to the fact they looked like any other ordinary houses, which enabled Christians to gather in private without fear of persecution and reprisal. One of the oldest house churches discovered was in Dura Europos in Syria. It contained several rooms and a baptistery, which is the style of the majority of churches to this day. The first known, genuine, purposely built church was discovered in Aqaba, modern-day Jordan. Ironically, it was built near the end of the 3rd century, shortly before the beginning of the severe Christian persecution under Diocletian. The reason it survived is generally attributed to the church being at the periphery of the Roman Empire. The persecutions were, for the most part, caused by the disruptive influence of Christianity on the Roman way of life and the functioning of the state. The main conflict here was between Christianity's seemingly individualistic nature and the focus on the state, city, or society by the Roman religion. For example, there were several instances where Roman state officials complained that due to an increasing number of conversions to Christianity, the Roman temples were emptying. This was a problem, as they feared disturbances to the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, and also because fewer people visiting the temples meant that there were fewer offerings and donations. Although the Neronic and Diocletianic persecutions are the most famous, they were not isolated cases. That is not to say that state-sanctioned persecutions were a rule or a perpetual practice, as most cases were localized and authorized by provincial governors or lesser state officials. The next persecutions happened during the reigns of Domitian and Marcus Aurelius. Following a lull in such activities during the next century, the persecutions resumed under Decius. He made it illegal not to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and to the Imperial Cult, exempting only the Jews from this law. Although these persecutions were severe, they were much harsher on paper than in practice. Many Roman governors were wary about creating more martyrs for Christianity, and preferred to turn a blind eye to what was happening within their lands as long as the offences were not particularly grievous. This was not the case with the aforementioned Diocletianic persecutions. Starting from 303, Diocletian and the other tetrarchs signed various edicts aimed at curbing the spread of Christianity and punishing Christians. Executions, torture, imprisonment, and the confiscation of property were commonplace during this time. How pervasive and harsh the state's measures were is a matter of intense scholarly debate. While some historians argue that many accounts of the persecutions were exaggerated in order to create a cult of martyrdom for Christianity, others consider those accounts to be correct. Contrary to popular belief, Christianity was not already the religion of the majority of the population prior to being officially recognized. By the beginning of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, there were tens of thousands of Christians in the empire. Christianity underwent explosive growth during Commodus's unstable reign and the crisis of the 3rd century, thriving during chaos and conflict. By the year 300, Christians represented as much as 10% of the population. This apparent success of Christianity can be attributed to many factors. Without a doubt, one of them is the religion's missionary nature. The very nature of Christianity was to actively proselytize and seek new converts whenever and wherever possible. Additionally, it was a universal religion, which means that the possible converts were not discriminated against based on ethnicity, prior religious beliefs, and social class. Christianity also seamlessly melded into Roman cultural and social life. The Christian Gospels were written with a vocabulary that would resonate with the majority of the Roman populace, the most notable examples being soteria, salvation, soter, saviour, and dominus, Lord. Even the very word for the Gospel, euangelion, was a common staple of the Imperial Cult's propaganda during the times of Augustus. Another reason for the rise of Christianity during times of great crisis was Christian charity work. Wars and pestilence brought forth innumerable injuries and illnesses to the people of the empire. While the state's response to the people's suffering was adequate, Christian communities provided aid beyond their meager means. When certain cities were suffering from an outbreak of illness, Christian communities offered curative and palliative aid to those afflicted. Doubtlessly, this considerably influenced the swelling of their numbers. Additionally, unlike their Roman counterparts, Christian priests were mostly available to the wider public and not considered a social elite. Virtually any commoner could seek out a priest for a confession, advice, or aid. It was this personal nature between the clergy and the devotees, as well as regular gatherings, that fostered a sense of community within the Christian population. Until the late 20th century, the relationship between paganism and Christianity within the Roman Empire was believed to be one of constant struggle, with Christianity coming out as the sole victor by the end. The reality was not even remotely so simple. In reality, Christianity grew and expanded at divergent tempos throughout the centuries. Even when Christianity was promoted to being the official religion of the empire, and many Romans converted to Christianity themselves, paganism still had a great influence. As the centuries passed, Christianity adopted many traits from paganism. The date for Christmas was chosen to coincide with Saturnalia, the holiday of the god Saturn. In fact, just as the Christmas holidays are referred to as the most wonderful time of the year, So did the Romans think of Saturnalia as the best time of the year. Even the tradition of gift-giving, which we closely associate with Christmas, was a phenomenon adopted from Saturnalia. Many Christians also engaged in dance before and after Mass, and sang hymns during religious processions, which was pagan behaviour. In southern Gaul, the bishop Caesarius wrote of the wretches who dance and caper about before the churches of the saints themselves, and if they appear at church as Christians, yet they leave the church as pagans, for that custom of dancing is still with us from pagan ritual. After it became the official religion of the empire, changes to architecture that occurred were significantly less drastic than is commonly believed. Slight aesthetic changes were dominant instead. Roman temples were transformed into Christian churches, and the statues of Roman gods and imperial figures in palaces, temples, and other important places were replaced by crosses and the Chi-Rho. The turning point, or rather the point of no return for Christianity in Rome, was Constantine the Great's conversion and the issuing of the Edict of Milan. Whether Constantine's conversion was complete, earnest, or symbolic is debatable, however its effects were monumental. As the emperor was someone that the people admired and looked up to, many decided to follow in his footsteps and adopt the new religion themselves. This was also pronounced among the aristocracy, many of whom became Christians in order to get into the emperor's good graces. With Christianity officially recognized as a religion, certain problems arose that were not as evident in previous centuries. As the religion was decentralized and communication between various religious centers was lacking, many different schools of thought developed in different regions. The first major schism to develop within Christianity was the Donatist controversy. Donatism developed during the Diocletianic purges in Africa, as some Christians falsely or earnestly renounced their faith to avoid persecution. This was done by turning in their scriptures to the state. This earned them the label of tradiores, traitors. The Donatists accused them of apostasy and argued that the clergy could not accept any of them as members. Due to other controversies and several divergent beliefs, several ecumenical councils were called. The first such council was the Council of Nicaea in 325, which led to the adoption of Nicaean Christianity as the official creed, and its separation from Arian Christianity. The Council of Ephesus and the Council of Chalcedon, in 431 and 451 respectively, led to the Church of the East and the Oriental Orthodox Church splitting off from Chalcedonian Christianity, which was adopted as the official version of Christianity in both parts of the Roman Empire. With only a handful of exceptions, most future emperors and pretenders to the throne were Christian, following Constantine's conversion. Near the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. With the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, paganism entered a period of terminal decline. The change in society was great, yet the new church adopted many of the traits of the pagan religious institutions. During the time when Pope Damasus was Bishop of Rome, the papacy gained a large amount of temporal power. By the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the power of the papacy in Rome surpassed that of even the Senate. Much like the pagan religious leaders of Rome wielded massive power during the times of the Republic and the early Empire, so did the Christian Church end up wielding. Furthermore, just as religious leaders were frequently chosen from prominent families when Rome was pagan, Christian bishops were also chosen from powerful families, oftentimes through bribes. During its many centuries of existence, the religious outlook of Rome changed numerous times, both through osmosis and by force. In the year 476, after many years on its deathbed, the Western Roman Empire fell. Although Christianity played a significant role in the latter stages of the Roman state's existence, it is safe to say that Rome, its culture, and previous religion exerted an equally great influence on Christianity itself, with numerous customs and traditions that we see today being able to trace their origin back to Roman culture. The Roman Empire may have died, yet aspects of Roman culture survive to this very day, and an important reason for that is the final Roman religion, Christianity, survived the empire and kept some of its traditions alive through the centuries. More videos on cultural, social, and religious history are on the way. To ensure you do not miss it, make sure you are subscribed and press the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.